Hello, everyone. My name is Fiona Schönberg, and for the next 18 minutes and change, I will be rambling about the procedural rhetoric in popular role-playing games as it pertains to money, the spending of money, and the player avatar's economic situations. Now, almost every mainstream role-playing game features some kind of diegetic currency. That can be any number of different flavors of gold coinage. It can be a surprising amount of different kind of galactic credits, or common in the cyberpunk genre, fusions of contemporary currency such as cyberpunk's Eurodollars or Shadowrun's Nuyen, or even something entirely different like the Fallout series Bottlecaps. While this is by no means an exhaustive list of games that what I'm going to talk to applies to, and chosen largely by virtue of being currently on my hard drive, all of the games that I'm showing you here share a number of commonalities in their depictions of the diegetic economy that are relevant for this presentation. Firstly, they all heavily feature profit as a motivator, both extra diegetically, with the promise of in-game resources often luring the player avatar away from the main story, and diegetically, with many of the player avatars being potentially or explicitly motivated by financial self-interest within the narrative. It's surely not by accident that bartering for or demanding greater monetary reward is one of the most common speech checks across any number of role-playing games. Secondly, these games all include some more or less tacit attempts at what I will refer to as life simulation. They acknowledge the basic material needs of the player avatar to various extents. These games feature ways to purchase food, to pay for temporary or permanent shelter, and they at least pay lip service to depicting diegetic poverty, to the consequences of those material needs not being met, whether that's shanty towns and loitering beggars in Skyrim, or well, basically everyone in Cyberpunk 2077. Thirdly, drawing from the first 2 points, in all of these games, at least as far as the player avatar is concerned, life is dirt cheap. Food is usually superfluous from a game mechanical perspective rather than a necessity of survival. Where it can be cooked, found, or purchased, its value is usually insignificant next to the amount of money that regularly passes through the main character's hands, and tends to only offer minute healing or the occasional slight buff. But even in games that feature usually optional survival mechanics like Fallout New Vegas, or that tie food supply to the resting mechanics like the recently released Baldur's Gate 3, food is never truly scarce, instead being easily picked up along the way and never truly a significant drain on the player avatar's wallet, should the player ever have forgotten or not bothered with collecting the bountiful food available to them. The same goes for shelter. Shelter and housing in role-playing games are usually a purely aesthetic choice, at most offering minor conveniences and easier access to crafting stations or item storage. In games where the player avatar is regularly required to rest, they are mostly quite happy to rest in the wilderness. Where that isn't an option, or where the narrative requires the player avatar to own a home, the game will happily provide a place to stay free of any charge, or at least any charge that occurs during gameplay. And even should the player elect to rent a room somewhere, this too will occur only a negligible expense. It bears mention that this phenomenon is almost unique specifically to role-playing games. For a rather illustrative example, we don't need to look further than Cyberpunk Edge Runner's protagonist David Martinez from the animated series, who inhabits the exact same apartment that the video game's protagonist does, but in a very different way. He's shown perpetually struggling to make ends meet, repeatedly locked out due to late rent payments, struggling to put food on the table, or even afford the laundromat. V, meanwhile, can tarry as much as they like. They don't need to eat, and rent will never be due. the economic uncertainty that is omnipresent in the narrative themes of the Cyberpunk franchise does not reach them. So what do player avatars spend their often vast fortunes on? To put simply, self-improvement. The majority of currency spent in a game goes towards improving their effectiveness at whatever, usually violent, trade earned them that money to begin with. This can happen somewhat indirectly by purchasing newer, better equipment, armor, weapons, ammunition, or consumables, but oftentimes improvements can also be purchased quite directly, such as Cyberpunk 2077 cyberware directly improving the avatar's body, or Skyrim's training mechanics directly improving the Dragonborn's abilities in exchange for coin. Money then, strictly speaking in game design terms, becomes a secondary gauge of game progress and character advancement next to more traditional experience counters. Still, its gameplay function is largely similar. It is accumulated naturally through playing the game. After all, the player avatar's work is almost always highly profitable, and it is expended largely to shape and customize the mechanical advancement of the player avatar. Following its function as an alternate progress gauge, the diegetic money also usually follows a similar pattern of exponential escalation as experience gain tends to. Early investments into equipment and improvement enable intermediate quests who yield ever greater rewards, enabling more expensive investments who in turn allow the completion of more challenging quests which yield the highest rewards. Vanity purchases, such as high-end player housing or vehicles, are usually reserved for purchase in these late-game stages, once enough money has been invested into a character build to meet all the challenges that even the end game has to offer. Now, so far, so familiar genre convention. But what is the procedural rhetoric, that is the persuasiveness of rule-based interactions or the ideology of rules-based interactions as per Ian Bogost, of this process? Playing the game, what I've called advancement here, generates profit. Profit is invested. Investment increases the player avatar's ability. Increased ability allows for further advancement. The cycle continues throughout the game, with superfluous purchases like player housing or cosmetics often relegated to late game rewards for generating sufficient cosmetic purchases. For no particular reason, here are some quotes from a self-help book authored by LinkedIn chairman Reid Hoffman. Now, these quotes could be decorating a loading screen in any number of the games I've discussed so far, and they wouldn't be bad advice. It's not without reason that hustle and gamer culture even share the common parlance of grinding. These games reward continuous investment in the digital self with ever greater financial incentive, but there are some notable differences between the diegetic worlds and the one that we inhabit. When it's challenged in public discourse, this sort of hustle and grind narrative, the myth of meritocracy based on willingness for self-improvement and risk-taking and investment, is commonly faced with a number of criticisms. In these games, however, none of these criticisms apply. Flesh and blood people have to worry about maintaining themselves, regardless of their willingness to improve or advance. They may simply not be able to. They simply might not be able to afford to live. The narrative of choosing between wasteful spending, the proverbial avocado toast, and self-improvement is easily questioned when there is no disposable income to begin with. On the other hand, player avatars, as mentioned initially, do not have to worry about meeting their basic needs. All, or at least most of their income is disposable, so investment into becoming more efficient at pursuing gainful activity becomes a much easier, much more obvious choice when the alternative is purely leisure or vanity spending rather than basic survival. Player avatars also take little to no financial risk in their investments. All the uncertainty of shifting demands or the cost for potential failure, the uncertainties of the modern job market are eschewed in the game. The nature of the gameplay loop mandates that the avatar's mechanical, if perhaps not narrative career is always in demand, just as it guarantees a steady supply of not just gainful, but profitable employment that will be balanced carefully to provide a beatable challenge to any who will keep up with the expected curve of character improvement. At worst, a player might invest into the wrong thing, purchase the wrong item, and be set back some amount of effort, but there will generally always be more opportunities to make money. And even should a player spend too aggressively, running out of funds only spells a temporary inability to invest further rather than the disaster of bankruptcy. And very much unlike someone choosing an occupation, choosing to learn a skill or one of the many other strategies that may very well not provide an edge in the modern job market, a player can gauge the exact mechanical effects of an investment they are thinking about, displayed in cold hard math that is accessible through the interface of the game. It's also relevant to mention here that all the player avatars we're discussing earn their keep doing what is effectively violent mercenary work. Now don't worry, I don't plan to regale you with yet another cautionary tale about violent video games, but for my purposes, what is important is this. Violence, certainly the way that role-playing games portray it, is an intimate act of clear and immediate competition. Committing acts of violence is an externalization of the sum total of merit, the player's planning and ability at using the game mechanics as well as the game statistics of their avatar pitted directly against a challenge. There's little in the way of external factors left to chance or fully outside the player's awareness that affect the outcome of a violent altercation. Overcoming these challenges that, depending on selected difficulty and similar choices within the player's control, may be more or less stacked in the avatar's favor, but will always remain guaranteed to be theoretically manageable, is designed to impart a feeling of power and personal achievement to the player, while aspects of design that aid the player are deliberately obfuscated. In relatively short, the way that a role-playing game player avatar turns a profit is immediately, intrinsically, and obviously tied to their personal merit and ability. As far as the procedural rhetoric imparts, there is no mechanical privilege. Player avatars succeed and inevitably, with the sliding scale of increasing difficulty and investment, progressively achieve greater wealth on the basis of their own personal capacity. Equally, the investments that the player makes into improving the character directly and immediately improve that capacity. At least in the worlds of those games, worlds mind which very much do contain and display poverty, the meritocracy is real, and since the accumulation of resources, much like experience points, is tied to gauging narrative progression, as far as the player avatar is concerned, as far as the player can mechanically experience, poverty is not only not that bad, representing little more than a temporary inability to spend rather than an existential threat. Worse, beyond the very early beginnings of a story, poverty in these games is a choice, brought about only by a refusal to play the game and incur inevitable profit, or by living well beyond your current means by making frivolous vanity purchases too early. The procedural rhetoric speaks, and it speaks with the voice of Ayn Rand. That's not to say that that's what these games are about. Their narratives, their design often paints a different picture. My point then, as concise as I can make it. A game world that features rampant poverty and economic inequality, with mechanical processes that all but guarantee that characters in this game world can rise from this poverty to the heights of wealth by the sweat of their brow, their merit, their willingness to grind alone, is not an ideology-free space. Now, This does not mean to imply intent on the part of any individual development team. Far from it. This hustle and grind mechanics are deeply ingrained in the conventions of role-playing game design, but they are by no means a necessary component. For an example of that, we need look no further than 2019's Disco Elysium. Protagonist Harry Dubois has a very different relationship with money. Money in Disco Elysium is collected largely through distractions from his main objective. Losing access to proper shelter has tangible narrative and mechanical implications. And for the most part, the mechanical benefits that can be purchased are temporary and directly linked to Harry Dubois' self-destructive vices. So it's not a necessity to incorporate this kind of ideologically charged procedural rhetoric, but it is certainly common practice. Now, Ian Bogost ended his 2007 book with a warning. We must recognize the persuasive and expressive power of procedurality. Processes influence us. They see changes in our attitudes, which in turn and over time change our culture. As creators and players of video games, we must be conscious of the procedural claims we make, why we make them, and what kind of social fabric we hope to cultivate through the processes we unleash on the world. At the end of this brief presentation, I would like to join his plea to the scholars looking at games, but also to fellow makers of games, to take great care in not simply including mechanics following genre convention and to not simply accept the familiar, but to carefully examine what the mechanics of a game are actually saying and to question if that aligns with how we want our games to speak. Thank you for your time.